Summer of 1970. The heat hung heavy over Beverly Hills like a velvet curtain, and behind the wrought iron gates of one of Hollywood's most exclusive mansions, a party was unfolding that would become the stuff of legend. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across a sea of tuxedos and evening gowns. Champagne flowed like water. Cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling in lazy spirals, mixing with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition. This was Hollywood at its peak, a glittering universe where gods walked among mortals, where careers were made and destroyed between cocktails, where a single conversation could change everything. Holding court near the grand piano like a king surveying his domain, stood Marion Robert Morrison, though the world knew him by another name, John Wayne, the Duke. At 63 years old, he was more than just an actor. He was America itself, wrapped in cowboy boots and cigarette smoke. For decades of films, over 170 movies, an Oscar sitting on his mantle for True Grit, won just a year before. His face was carved from granite, his voice a rolling thunder that had defined what it meant to be a man for an entire generation. When John Wayne spoke, Hollywood listened. When John Wayne disapproved, careers trembled. Tonight, Wayne was in rare form, surrounded by old friends, Dean Martin nursing a whiskey in the corner, studio executives laughing at his every word. The Duke held a glass of tequila and surveyed the room with those famous eyes that had stared down 1,000 outlaws on screen. But there was something else in those eyes tonight, something darker, because across the room, threading through the crowd with the quiet confidence of a mountain lion, was the man John Wayne despised more than any other in Hollywood. Tall, lean, with steel blue eyes that seemed to look right through you. He moved differently than the other actors. No swagger, no desperate need to be noticed. Just a coiled stillness that made people unconsciously step aside. 6 years ago, he had been a nobody, a failed contract player doing a TV western called Rawhide that was running out of steam. Then he had done something unthinkable. He had gone to Europe, to Italy, to make westerns with some director nobody had ever heard of, and somehow, impossibly, he had come back a star. If you want to discover how this confrontation between two titan-shaped Hollywood forever, what John Wayne said that made the entire room go silent, and the ice-cold response that established Clint Eastwood as a legend in his own right, stay until the end of this story. Trust me, you won't regret it. The tension between these two men had been building for years, simmering beneath the surface of Hollywood's golden facade like magma waiting to erupt. It wasn't personal, at least, not at first. It was philosophical. It was about what a Western meant, what a hero should be, what America itself represented on screen. John Wayne had built his legend on a foundation of moral clarity. His cowboys were good men, flawed perhaps, rough around the edges, but fundamentally decent. They protected women and children. They fought for justice. They represented the American ideal, the shining city on the hill translated into dusty trails and cattle drives. Wayne had bled for this vision, literally. He had turned down countless roles that didn't fit his image. He had built an empire on being the man America wanted to be, and then Clint Eastwood had come along and burned it all. Down, the man with no name. That's what they called Eastwood's character in those Italian films. No backstory, no noble motivations. Just a ghost in a poncho who killed for money and spoke in monosyllables. He wasn't a hero. He was an anti-hero, morally ambiguous, dangerous, unpredictable. And audiences loved him. They loved him in a way that terrified the old guard, because it suggested that maybe, just maybe, the American myth was changing, that the white hats and black hats were blending into something grayer, something more honest, something more real. Wayne had made his feelings clear in interviews. He called the spaghetti westerns Italian garbage. He mocked their violence, their cynicism, their lack of traditional American values. That Italian stuff, he had told one reporter, it isn't what the West was about. It's a perversion. He never mentioned Eastwood by name, but everyone knew who he was talking about. The message was clear. Clint Eastwood was not welcome in John Wayne's West, but Eastwood had never responded. Not once. He had simply kept making films, kept building his career, kept that famous silence that drove his critics crazy. You couldn't fight a man who wouldn't fight back. You couldn't defeat an enemy who refused to acknowledge the war. And so Wayne's frustration had grown, year after year. Until tonight, the party swirled around them both, oblivious to the collision course that fate had set. Dean Martin was telling a joke near the bar. Somewhere, a woman laughed too loudly. Ice clinked in glasses. The band played something soft and forgettable. And John Wayne began to move. Later, witnesses would describe it differently. Some said Wayne had been drinking heavily all night. Others insisted he was stone-cold sober, that what happened next was entirely deliberate. But everyone agreed on one thing. The Duke walked straight toward Clint Eastwood with the determination of a man who had made a decision. Eastwood saw him coming. Of course he did. Those eyes missed nothing. He was standing near the French doors that led to the garden, a glass of beer in his hand, talking quietly with a young actress whose name history has forgotten. When he saw Wayne approaching, he didn't move, didn't tense, just watched with that famous squint, the one that had made outlaws reconsider their life choices in a dozen films. The crowd seemed to sense something. Conversations faltered, heads turned. A space opened up around the two men, as if by magic, the other guests unconsciously retreating to a safe distance. Even Dean Martin stopped mid-joke, his glass frozen halfway to his lips. Wayne stopped 3 feet from Eastwood. Up close, the contrast between them was stark. Wayne was broader, heavier, his face weathered by decades of hard living. Eastwood was leaner, younger, with a stillness that made Wayne's barely contained energy seem almost chaotic by comparison. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Wayne smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a gunfighter who had finally cornered his prey. "So," Wayne said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "you're the one who's been playing cowboy in those Italian pictures." Eastwood took a slow sip of his beer. "That's right. I've seen them," Wayne continued, and there was something dangerous in his tone now. "All that shooting, all that killing, no honor, no decency." He shook his head in disgust. "That's not what the West was about, son. That's not what being a man is about." The room held its breath. This was it, the confrontation everyone had whispered about for years, finally happening in the flesh. Clint Eastwood, the young pretender, versus John Wayne, the undisputed king. David and Goliath in tuxedos. Eastwood said nothing, just watched, waited. Wayne took another step closer. "You know what your problem is, Eastwood? You don't understand what you're representing up there on that screen. You're showing kids that it's okay to be a killer, that there's no right and wrong, that a man can do whatever he wants as long as he's fast enough with a gun." His voice rose. "You're poisoning the well, and you don't even know it." Still, Eastwood remained silent. But something had changed in his eyes. A hardness, a cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. "Nothing to say?" Wayne pressed, emboldened by the silence. "That's your whole act, isn't it? The strong, silent type. Well, let me tell you something, friend. I was doing the strong and silent routine while you were still in diapers. The difference is, I had something to say. I stood for something." He jabbed a finger toward Eastwood's chest. "What do you stand for?" "Nothing. You stand for absolutely nothing." The tension in the room was suffocating. Several guests had already slipped away, unwilling to witness what might come next. Dean Martin had set down his drink and was watching with the wary expression of a man calculating the distance. "To the nearest exit. And then John Wayne said the 6 words that would echo through Hollywood. History, he leaned in close enough that Eastwood could smell the tequila on his breath, and spoke in a low growl that somehow carried to every corner of the room. "You're not a real Western star." Silence. Absolute, crushing silence. The kind of silence that follows a gunshot, when the world holds its breath waiting to see who falls. For what felt like an eternity, Clint Eastwood didn't move, didn't blink. His face was carved from stone, expressionless, unreadable. The steel-blue eyes remained fixed on Wayne's face with an intensity that made several onlookers physically uncomfortable. This was the look, the one that had terrified audiences in theaters around the world. The look of a man deciding whether or not to kill you. When Eastwood finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, so quiet that people had to lean in to hear, so controlled that it made Wayne's bluster seem almost childish by comparison. "You finished?" Wayne blinked. This wasn't the response he had expected. He had expected anger, defensiveness, maybe even a swing. He had been in bar fights before, had thrown punches on sets, had lived the tough guy image he projected on screen. He knew how to handle a confrontation. But he didn't know how to handle this absolute, unshakable calm. Because here's the thing, Duke, Eastwood continued, still in that soft voice. The West you're talking about, the one with the white hats and the noble cowboys. It never existed. You know it. I know it. The audience is starting to know it. He took another sip of his beer, casual, unhurried. Times are changing. The stories are changing. And you can either change with them, or you can keep yelling at clouds. Wayne's face had gone red. Now listen here. No. The word was quiet, but it cut through Wayne's bluster like a blade. You've had your say. Now I'm having mine. Eastwood straightened slightly, and suddenly he seemed taller, more imposing, despite being younger and leaner than the Duke. I respect what you've done. I grew up watching your films. But respect goes both ways, and right now, standing here telling me I'm not a real Western star, a ghost of a smile crossed his face. That doesn't sound like respect. That sounds like fear. The word hung in the air like smoke. Fear. John Wayne, the Duke, America's cowboy, afraid of Clint Eastwood. The suggestion was outrageous, insulting. And yet, looking at the scene from the outside, seeing Wayne red-faced and blustering while Eastwood stood calm as a frozen lake, it was hard not to wonder. Who really had the power here? Who was really in control? Wayne opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For perhaps the first time in his legendary career, John Wayne was speechless. Eastwood nodded once, as if the matter was settled. Enjoy your party, Duke. You've earned it. And with that, he turned and walked away, moving through the stunned crowd like a ship through still water. Leaving John Wayne standing alone with his tequila and his wounded pride, the party resumed. Eventually, the music started again. Conversations flickered back to life. But something had shifted in that room, something fundamental. Everyone who witnessed that confrontation would remember it for the rest of their lives. They had watched the old Hollywood and the new Hollywood collide, and they had seen which one flinched first. John Wayne and Clint Eastwood never spoke again. Not once. In the 9 years between that party and Wayne's death in 1979, they circled each other like rival planets, each defining their own orbit, each pretending the other didn't exist. When asked about Eastwood in interviews, Wayne would change the subject. When asked about Wayne, Eastwood would simply say he was a legend, and leave it at that. But the industry remembered. The young directors and actors who had witnessed that confrontation carried the story with them, passed it down like folklore. The night Clint Eastwood stood up to John Wayne. The night the torch was passed. The night that proved you didn't need to shout to be heard, didn't need to bluster to be strong, didn't need anyone's approval to know your own worth. Eastwood went on to become exactly what Wayne had said he would never be, a real Western star. And more unforgiven, the outlaw Josie Wales. Pale Rider, High Plains Drifter. He didn't just continue the Western genre. He transformed it, evolved it, gave it a depth and moral complexity that resonated with a changing America. And when he won his Oscars Best Director, Best Picture, there were those who remembered that night in Beverly Hills and smiled. John Wayne remained a legend until the end. His films are still watched, still beloved, still defining what many people think of when they imagine the American West. But his vision was no longer the only vision. The door he had guarded so jealously had been kicked open, and a new generation of storytellers had come flooding through. Some say the Western died with John Wayne. Others say Clint Eastwood saved it by forcing it to grow up. Perhaps both are true. Perhaps that's the nature of art. Each generation must kill its fathers to become itself. What remains is the lesson of that night, the lesson that true strength isn't loud, that confidence doesn't need validation, that the most powerful thing you can do when someone tries to diminish you is simply refuse to be diminished. Clint Eastwood didn't defeat John Wayne with a clever comeback or a thrown punch. He defeated him by being exactly who he was, completely an unapologetic ally. As Eastwood himself once said, a man's got to know his limitations, but he also has to know his strengths. And sometimes, the greatest strength is the ability to stand still while the world rages around you. If it taught you something about strength, dignity, and staying true to yourself in the face of opposition, I'd love to hear about it. Hit that like button if you felt the tension in that Beverly Hills mansion. Subscribe if you want more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age. Share this with someone who needs to hear that you don't have to shout to be heard. And drop a comment below. Tell me, What would you have said to John Wayne in that moment? The conversation continues, and your voice matters. Until next time, remember, legends aren't born. They're forged, one confrontation at a time.